You know, we all have things that we are not willing to compromise on. Well, in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about things that God says that we should be taking a stand on. Hello everybody, this is Pastor Lyle and welcome to Daily Renewal. If this is your first time tuning in with us, I just want to ask you to consider becoming a subscriber to our channel. Also, feel free to share these videos with anybody that you think that they will help. That's why we do them. Also, it helps us if you hit the like button, if you ring the bell. If you do that, then you're going to know when any of the new videos are out. And we've got over 200 episodes of Daily Renewal that are all designed to help you in your Christian walk. Have you ever heard the expression, "What hill are you willing to die on?" You know, it really comes to mind with some of the things that I've seen this week in some of my dealings with people. You know, with 2020, there's a lot of things that have come up, that a lot of causes that have come up that people get very excited about, very passionate about, and even very angry about. You know, one of the things that I see often right now where I'm from is there's a real big discrepancy with people on what they think of mask mandates, for example. You know, some people say you need to wear a mask, and if you don't wear a mask, you don't really care about people. And then there's those who don't want to wear a mask, and they say, well, they're taking our freedoms away, and if they take this one, what's next? And, you know, we can come up with what we believe are really good arguments for some of these things. You know, for me as a pastor, one of the arguments that comes up is, you know, there's a lot of people say, you know, this is not right that the government tells us how many people we can have in our church and tell us that at certain times, like where I'm from right now, the government's actually telling us we can't have anybody in our churches. And, you know, so there's people that I've seen online, a lot of different pastors that say, you know, it's our God-given right to assemble together. And, you know, as I look at that, and if you've watched Daily Renewal at all, you'll know that I talk about this particular subject, and I think we have to check our motives on all these things. You know, I know that for a lot of churches, if they don't continue to get together, you know, financially, they're not going to be able to pay for their buildings, they're not going to be able to pay for their programs, they're not going to be able to pay a real nice salary for their pastor. And, you know, if those are the reasons that we need to get together is because the finances aren't coming in, well, you know, God knows the thoughts and intents of our heart, and I can tell you, that's not a good enough reason for the church to continue meeting together. You know, I also say this, that as far as the idea of us not forsaking the assembling of ourselves, that was also written at a time where we didn't have the internet, where we didn't have Zoom calls. Now, I know that's not the best way necessarily to get together, but really the idea of us being able to get together and why God wanted his people to get together, you know, we can do that without having to use the excuse of going to our nice flashy buildings to do a lot of things, a lot of religious calisthenics that really I think that we need to reevaluate anyway. I think this is a great time and that God has allowed his church to reevaluate a lot of the things that we're doing. And for me, honestly, you know, I live in North America, and we've had it very easy when it comes to church. You know, we've had it very comfortable. You know, I purposely have, you know, the Lord has led me to look into some church movements outside of North America. I'm personally involved with a ton of Spanish churches. You sure get to see a lot of different looks through that. But also, you know, I look into the church in China, the church in Iran, which apparently is the fastest growing church in the world right now. And they don't do church the same as we do in North America. There's quite a big difference. And I think I look at this as all being a good thing. But I say all that to say this. You know, we take up our causes, and I think if we're not careful, and this is what I really want to get into today, we have to be careful that the cause that we take up really is something that God wants us to take up. Because if it's just something that we're taking up because it affects our comfort level, it affects how I feel about things, then it really needs to be evaluated. For instance, the idea of wearing a mask. There's been different ideas on whether it's right or whether it's good for you, or whether it's not good for you. Right now they're saying that you wear a mask because of the sake of someone else. For me personally, I've got my own reservations about that, but I also have no problem wearing one because I know that probably 70% of the country, that's my estimate, it looks at people a little different, or they're a little bit fearful if somebody doesn't have a mask in their presence. So whether I agree with it, whether it works or not, I'm not here to bring fear to other people. I'm here to be a representative of God, and as long as it isn't something that God says that I shouldn't be doing, then I should have no problem doing it for the sake of other people. For me as a Christian, my part of the mandate that God has for me is to reach people for Christ. And if I'm going to reach people, then I can't have them mad at me before I even get any words out of my mouth. So today I want to focus on some things that if you're a believer, these are things that you should be willing to die on that hill. In other words, these are things that I will not compromise no matter what happens. And you have to have set in your heart that these are things that no matter what anybody says, no matter what anybody does to you, no matter what the world says, no matter what the government tries to tell you, these are things that are not up for debate. That if these things come at you, you cannot compromise. And the first one I want to talk to you about today is the preaching of the gospel. In a lot of churches today, the idea of the preaching of the gospel, the good news about why Jesus came, what was accomplished on the cross when Jesus died on the cross, rose again, and now is seated at the right hand of the Father. The idea of the gospel. And yet I know a lot of people, a lot of churches, and even church leaders that can't give even a clear presentation of the gospel. There's a lot of people say, oh, if you just come to my church, my pastor will tell you about Jesus. Or if you just watch this guy online, he'll be able to tell you, present the gospel. But the Bible's very clear that we are to preach the gospel in every opportunity we have to every creature. And so we need to know what the gospel is. But that being the case, you might say, well, Pastor Lyle, we don't have anybody coming against us saying we can't preach the gospel. Well, I can tell you this, that a lot of these countries outside of North America, there's people who take their life in their own hands by preaching the gospel. There's people that have died, and I mention this often, but in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of persecution against God's people for doing just that, preaching the gospel. But I will say that with the way things are going now, we're upset about masks. We're upset about not being able to meet. I can tell you this. I really believe that we're coming to the place, and the Bible that talks about this in many places, about some of the things that are going to happen against the church in the last days. So the idea of us being able to freely preach the gospel, this is something that we may look at and say, well, there's no way that's ever going to happen. Yeah, well, there's a lot of us here that never thought we'd be locked up in our houses and that we wouldn't be able to meet in church either just a year ago. The idea of coming against the gospel is something that is going to be upon us. There's already a lot of people that consider the Bible hate speech. And even in my country, there's people that have gone to court over certain scriptures that they preached where somebody heard them and wanted to classify it as hate speech. We have to understand that if this kind of thing happens, if somebody comes to you and tells you that, you can no longer do that, this is an area where you cannot compromise. The idea of getting put in prison or being persecuted for preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, we saw this all through the New Testament. For instance, in Acts 4, Peter and John just finished healing a guy, and we see starting in verses 1 to 4, talks about the fact that guys were upset about this, and they ended up taking them into custody. And it wasn't much later that we see in Acts 5 starting in verse 17, some of the high priest and some of the Sadducees, which were some of the religious order of the day, got upset and they put all the apostles into prison. And it just so happened that after that happened, an angel came and freed them. And what was the first thing the angel told them to do? He told them to go back into the temple and speak the words of life. In other words, here they are preaching the gospel, they get put in prison, and the angel releases them and confirms that what they were doing, even though man may not have liked it, it was exactly what God wanted them to do. And if you keep reading through the New Testament, you'll find that the guy that wrote most of the New Testament, Apostle Paul, especially from Acts 24 to 28, he wrote a lot of the books of the New Testament while he was in prison. There's story after story about he would go into these places, and just for preaching the gospel, people would either imprison him or stone him or do something to him. They were basically forbidding him to preach Jesus. Which brings me to my next point that kind of dovetails into that, is another thing that we have to make sure that we don't compromise, is the idea of preaching Jesus and Jesus only. Jesus said in John 14:6, he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Now, one of the things that breaks my heart is when I see people who have a Christian platform or who are basically standing up for Christianity, and they've got maybe thousands, maybe millions of followers listening to them, and they compromise in preaching Jesus. Now, what do I mean by that? Jesus was clear that there is only one way to heaven. Now, so if he was clear, then who am I to say that there's another way? And this is very controversial for a lot of people. They say, Christians are so set in their ways. There's many ways to heaven. Well, no, actually, according to Jesus, there's only one way, and it's through him. So for me, as a believer, whether I like that or not, or whether I choose to embrace that or not, the fact is that if Jesus said there's only one way, that means there's only one way. Now, unless Jesus is a liar, which that's not going to hold any water either, because other religions consider Jesus to be a good man. How can he be a good man? Again, other religions, they either say that Jesus is a prophet, a true prophet, or a good man. Well, how can he be a true prophet or a good man if he is a liar? No, Jesus said this straight out. There's only one way to the Father, and it's through me. So any preaching that you hear that says that there's more to one way to heaven than other than through Jesus, they're wrong. Plain and simple. We have to make the firm decision to take Jesus at his word. Now, the next part that goes into that, again, this all goes with not compromising the gospel, is the idea of not renouncing the gospel. If you ever put in a position where somebody says, it's Jesus or your life, it's at that point that I really hope, my friend, and I hope for me, that if I'm ever in that position, that my relationship with God is at a place, just like we see with a lot of people in the New Testament. There's history shows that they were willing to die for their faith. All through church history, one of the greatest stories that I remember reading about was the story of Polycarp. They came to arrest Polycarp. He was a second generation Christian. Everybody had huge respect for him. And, he was getting older. And the ruler at that time in Rome wanted to make some statements. He wanted to get rid of Christians. And so he thought, what? I'm going to find that old Polycarp, and I'm going to make him renounce Christ. And as the story goes, he arrests Polycarp, and he basically brings him into I guess a stadium or whatever. He ties him to a post, and he's going to burn him. And as the story goes, he says, look, all you have to do is say, down with the atheists, because Christians were considered atheists at the time. And he says, well, I got no problem with that, down with the atheists. And then he says, now all you have to do, and I'll set you free, is if you say that I don't believe in this Jesus. And it was at that point that Polycarp looked deep within himself, and he uttered the words as close as I can relay them. Something like this. He says, "How can I do that for the one who has done so much for me?" And at that point, he could have been let free, but he said, "I can't deny Jesus." And I think we have to understand that this whole idea of believing in Jesus, this whole idea of really having a firm relationship with him is important. We cannot deny him. And Polycarp, he didn't deny him, and they tried burning him. It turns out he wouldn't burn. So the way that he died is they ended up having to stick a spear through him. But as a result, there was many people that came to Christ that day because this man took a stand. There was something that was beyond human that this guy was willing to do because he had a relationship that a lot of the onlookers couldn't make any sense of. And that's the way Christianity is there's a lot of things that, if people look at Christianity as just a religion, a bunch of rules and regulations, that's not what it is. It's a relationship that transforms you from the inside out. And Polycarp understood this, and for us, that's our goal, is to have such a firm relationship with Jesus that even if we're faced with death, that we're willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to take that rather than say no to Jesus. Jesus was really clear. He also said in Matthew 10:33, he says, "But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven." It's sad to say, but I even know preachers. I remember one preacher that I used to be close with, and I heard him say it multiple times. He used to make a joke about it. He said, if I was ever in a situation where I had a gun to my head and somebody said, "Renounce Jesus or die," he says, what I would do is I would renounce, and then when I got by myself, I'd say, "Well, Jesus, I didn't mean it." There's people all over the world right now that are faced with that same question, that don't have the same comforts as maybe you and I do, who when they're faced with that question, they have such a deep resolve about what Jesus has done for them that they would rather die than renounce Jesus. And this brings me to my next point. A lot of times we're put into situations where God might reveal something to us, and when he does, we have to make the decision. Am I going to do what I really feel God is telling me to do, or am I just going to keep doing things my own way? And one of the ways to explain this is through what's called idol worship. There's lots of places in the Bible where it talks about how we're not supposed to, have any idols. In fact, the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And often when we look at the idea of having gods, or idols, it's basically putting something in the place of God, or putting something as being more important to us than God is to us. And that might sound like a big deal, like it would have to be something big. But really, if we analyze our lives, there's a lot of times where we can be confronted by things that God says, "You know what? I think that this thing is more important to you than I am." And when we have those kind of things in our lives, we have a decision to make. It's at that point that we either go in God's direction or we go in our own direction. And our own direction never works out. So the idea of having idols, in 1 Corinthians 10:14, it says, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." When there's things in our lives that are obvious to us, that God's revealed to us, are not pleasing to him, our response should be, I want to get rid of that as quick as possible. And, it's interesting because it's different for each person often. The idea of idolatry, it comes in many forms. But what might be an idol to one might not be an idol to another. And here's what I suggest. I found many years ago, I'll give you an example. There was some different customs that I had in my life that I didn't think were a real big deal. They were culturally, they were acceptable. People didn't think there's anything wrong with them, or they might have thought there was something wrong with it, but couldn't quite put their finger on it. And things that are celebrated that a lot of people, like I said, didn't see a problem with it. But then I began to read in the scripture, and there were some things that God began to point out to me that made me second guess some of these things. And like I said, even though they were culturally acceptable, God began to work on my heart. And it was at that point that he brought me to a scripture in Deuteronomy that put it into a place where I could understand a little better. And it was Deuteronomy 12, starting in verse 29. It said this, and this is in the Old Testament. It said, "When the Lord your God cuts off from before you the nations which you go to dispossess, and you displace them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, 'How did these nations serve their gods?' I also will do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates, they have done to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters and the fire to their gods. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it or take away." Now, what I got out of this was any ritual, any custom that I have, number one, I want to evaluate it and see, is it based out of the Bible? Because there's a lot of customs, for instance, in North America, around the world, that we celebrate that are actually based on pagan nations' customs. And we see here what God was talking about is you got to be very careful with some of your customs, not to pick up customs from pagan nations. We need to get all of our customs from God and God's way of doing things. And he ends this by saying he doesn't want to add to or take away anything that he's already talked about doing as far as customs. So in my particular situation, I was really confronted about some things that were really important to me in my life. And, God was really gentle with me. I said, "Lord, is there really a problem with this? I mean, I see in your word that it is. So therefore now I've got to make some decisions." So at that time I said, "Lord, how do I change this? I don't want to do things that are not pleasing to you." And, for all of us, whether it's something like that or whether it's anything in our life, that when we really are honest with ourselves, we put up in front of God, in other words, something that is more important to us than God. The first step is admitting that it's there and that it's in the position that it's in. And second, asking God to forgive us for that. But third, asking him to help us get over that. Help us view this in the proper perspective. And I'm going to tell you that if you start praying about God to reveal things in your life that are idols, you're going to see some things that are really going to challenge you. But the great part about it is that as you take up the challenge and as you make the adjustments, these are all things that are going to help you grow closer to God. They're going to help you see dimensions of God that you weren't able to see before. All of these other things tend to cloud our perception of God. And it's God's desire for us to see him clearly so that we could truly experience everything that he has created for us to be able to experience in him. Now, the next one that I want to talk to you about actually dovetails really nicely with the idea of not compromising to idols. And it's this: I will never compromise being able to worship and pray and communicate with God. No matter who tells me I can't, it doesn't matter what happens, what situation, I am going to continue to relate with my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter who says I can't, I will. Now you might say, well, who's going to do that? When does that ever happen? Actually, there's been a couple times. The book of Daniel has a couple stories. One in regarding bowing to false or other gods. You can see in chapter 3 of Daniel the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's one. But the one that I want to focus on right now is also in the book of Daniel, and it was a plot to kill Daniel. And there was a bunch of people that didn't like Daniel because Daniel had the ear of the king. Even though he was an Israelite, the king really liked Daniel. Daniel always came through for him. And so a bunch of these people who were jealous of Daniel tried to get the king to put together a mandate so they could take out Daniel. And so what we pick up in chapter 6, verse 7, it says, all the governors of the kingdom and administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, talking to the leader, except you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions. And now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. And now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. See, these men knew that that was his custom. And then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So they set him up. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, this thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. And so they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed. But he makes his petition 3 times a day. And when the king heard these words, he was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Well, what happened was he wasn't able to deliver him, and he ended up having to stick Daniel into this lion's den. We skip down to verse 18. It says, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also, his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done nothing wrong before you. It's really important that we understand, if somebody is trying to tell you that it's not legal or not right, or that you can't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, that they're limiting you being able to do that, then you have to make the decision to not bow down to what they say. It is your God-given right to be able to communicate with him. In fact, one of the core reasons that God even created us is to communicate with him. So if somebody else tries to tell you that you can't, you can override them. And, have wisdom with it. I look at this. Daniel was pretty open about it. Maybe we need to be open about it, but I would say this. It doesn't matter really what anyone says. We have to understand that this is something we can and should. We have to take a stand on. I'm not going to quit talking to Jesus just because somebody told me I can't. Now, the next one is goes along with some of the things we've been talking about the past couple weeks on Daily Renewal, and that's on how to deal with false teachers. I listened to a guy on the internet the other day who, he's very well respected by a lot of people, and yet I was so disappointed. I'm not going to give you his name, but I was so disappointed. He talks about, the fact that there's people upset with him because he won't renounce certain false teachers. And, he had a lot of excuses on why he shouldn't and all this stuff. And it comes down to this. In this last day, we know that there's going to be lots of false teachers. Well, how should we deal with them? I'm going to give you an illustration to show you just how important it is that we deal with them properly. If you have a loaded gun in the house, are you going to allow your 10-year-old child to play with it when you're not home? No, of course you're not. You're going to do everything you can to get that gun away from a child. That is not a smart idea. And it's the same with false teachers. Right now, if there's teachers, any of the fivefold ministry, apostle, prophet, pastor, evangelist, or teacher, if there's any of them that are doing things or saying things that don't line up with the Bible, don't continue listening to them. Don't continue playing with a loaded gun. Get away from them. Get as far away from them as you can. And if they want to know why, well then, from that point, really, if you have an opportunity to confront somebody about some of the things they teach, often you can't if they're a TV preacher or, even local pastors sometimes won't allow you to speak anything in into their lives. If they're preaching stuff that's wrong, you need to get away from it. Don't play around with it. The longer you play around with it, the more opportunity the enemy has to take you out. No sense playing around in these days. Don't compromise when it comes to false teachers. Now, the last one I want to talk to you about that you have to always keep in mind that you never want to compromise is your morality. We need to understand that us living a holy life is really important. The example that people see. And it doesn't mean you're going to live a flawless life. It doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes along the way. But how you take care of those things and the importance that you put on that in your life is really, it needs to be top priority. For myself, I want to be somebody, not just because I'm a pastor, but I want to be a Christian that allows God to transform things in my life, to change who I am, so that I would be consistently molded and shaped to be more like Jesus. That's one of the major goals that God has for each and every one of us. But that starts with us allowing Him to do that. Our lifestyle is imperative. It's really important that we come to know just how much Jesus loves us. Because when we have a deep revelation of how loved we are by God, it'll change how we love people. I used to think I understood what love was, but I didn't. Not until God began to show me just how much He loved me. And it's from there that He begins to transform us on the inside to where other people will see that there really is a difference between those who know Jesus and those who don't. And the difference is how they love. We see Jesus talks about this in John 13:35. He says, "By this all will know you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." People are going to know us by the way that we love. So it's very important that we allow God to do that work in our lives. Now, the idea of loving people, honestly, I could tell you, I deal with people a lot, especially in pastoring. There's a lot of situations I've seen. I've seen people that are easy to love and people that are just a little bit tougher. And you know which ones wear you out the most? The ones that are a little bit tougher. And, I've had different times in my life where I really felt like I was really getting worn out. Here you are, you're trying to do your best, and every time you feel like you're gaining ground, it seems like somebody or something comes at you, and maybe sometimes you just feel like giving up. Well, this is why it's really important to live a lifestyle of faith. Because God, if we just hold on to Him, He actually encourages us not to grow weary in doing good. We see this in Galatians 6:9. It says, "Don't grow weary in well-doing." Understand that by you continuing in tough circumstances, as long as you continue to get up, as long as you continue to dust yourself off and continue to go to Jesus, continue to do what's right, continue to submit your life to Him, there's going to be a time where that weariness will be gone, where there'll be times of refreshing for you, because God wants to give you that. And it's with that I'll end with this. In Matthew 5, this is a great way to look at your life and understand that you are here for a reason. And Jesus said this in Matthew 5, starting in verse 14. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Don't be weary in well-doing, my friend. Let your light shine. Understand that as you continue to walk toward God, other people are going to observe Jesus through you. We've been given a great opportunity as we walk with him, as we do good works that were prepared for us before the foundations of the world. As we just continue to walk with God, people are going to see him and they're going to be attracted to him because we are being affected by what God's doing in us. We don't do good works just for the sake of doing good works. No, if you're walking with Jesus, you're naturally going to do what your Father does. Just like Jesus said he did what he saw the Father doing. As you stick with Jesus, you're going to find that your good works aren't going to be something that you're just going to produce on your own. You're going to naturally do good works and because you are reflecting the light of the true light of the world. He says that we're the light of the world here. What we are is we're like the moon. We're a reflection of what the sun reflects off of the moon. Think of yourself that way. We have to see that we're reflectors of Jesus' light. So with that, be encouraged, my friend, that we have been given opportunity and God is using you to help others come to know him and also help others come to a deeper relationship with him as we walk with him. You play a role in this. Well, I hope you got something out of that today. If you did, I just want to encourage you again, if you're not a subscriber to our channel, subscribe. Hit the like button, ring the bell, share these videos with as many people as you think they will help. If you are a subscriber and you got something out of this in particular, something stuck out to you, feel free to make a comment about it. That also helps us get the videos out to more people. Well, I enjoyed our session of Daily Renewal today, but I'm looking forward to our next one. Until then, God bless you and have a great day.